The Australian housing market is screwed.
It's always the worst people you know who say the dumbest shit so confidently. Like, of course, someone who's got a masterclass course in wealth creation is telling us how the housing crisis happened in Australia. Now, this video does suck, but there are some interesting things here worth talking about and some things that people may believe.
I'm going to show you exactly why the property market is so out of reach for the everyday Aussie, with the help of some sweet treats. We've got government housing, your homeowners, your renters. Over here, immigration waiting to come in. These are our snakes of the market, our government and our builders. Let's go back to the 90s where everything just worked. Here's why it worked. Notice all the vacant homes. We got more homes than people.
You can automatically dismiss the opinion of anyone who says shit like this. Anyone who romanticizes the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, 60s, whatever decade that they say everything was working fine and dandy until the big bad happened, their take's garbage. It's not worth it. But there is a nostalgia that does rot people's brains politically when it comes to housing. And it goes across political lines. You know, conservatives, progressives, a lot of them have this very romantic view of the past, and they often pick whatever decade suits them, whether it be the 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, whatever, right? Whatever decade was the housing utopia in Australia, that's the decade they pick, and the moment we diverted from those policy settings, then everything went to shit, right? Whether it be particular tax settings, whether it be immigration, whether it be X, Y, or Z. So look, even though we may roll our eyes and whatever, it is something that we do need to contend with. So let's actually look at what happened in the 1990s. Now, why you'd pick the 1990s as your golden decade? Don't know, because the 1990s started off with a bang with this little known thing called the recession we had to have, or what it was dubbed by Keating at the time, right? And it was one of the, it still is today, one of the worst recessions on record in Australia. Unemployment rose to like 10%, whatever, right? And a big part of the reason why we entered that recession was because of a property boom, a property price bubble that had accrued in the mid to late 1980s. And that resulted in our own localized subprime mortgage crisis where low-income homeowners or mortgage holders were pressured into buying these, you know, shoddy houses with arrangements they obviously couldn't afford. That inevitably failed. You know, you had building societies collapsing, which in part led to the privatization of CommBank. It wasn't a good time, at least at the start of the 1990s in the housing market. It wasn't a good time to be a house in the 90s. Anyway, the government was pretty well aware that, you know, the housing market wasn't particularly in great shape in the 1990s. And so in 1992, the then Treasurer John Dawkins commissioned an in-depth study into housing. And what it found was very interesting. So in the commission's view, overinvestment in real estate had crowded out more productive investment in the Australian economy. And it argued the market would continue to fail in delivering low rental, good quality accommodation. In fact, because housing was getting more and more expensive and people's incomes weren't keeping up, the public housing waitlist actually grew significantly, to which the Hawke-Keating governments at the time didn't respond by investing more into public housing, but simply by increasing private rental assistance and trying to deregulate the market further. But at the same time, household indebtedness, people getting more loans, bigger loans for longer periods of time to bid up higher and higher house prices, was growing and growing. So housing was getting less affordable, it was getting less accessible, there was less public housing, and at the same time, people were accessing greater amounts of credit, they were going into greater amounts of debt to buy up higher and higher house prices. During this time, home ownership fell. So the idea that the 90s was this great time of housing prosperity is just ridiculous. Rather, the 90s kind of marks the beginning of our housing fuckery today. At least the current phase of significant house price growth began after the 1990 recession, due to in part the financial reforms made in the 90s and 80s.
Here's why it worked. Notice all the vacant homes. We got more homes than people. Now, government housing...
Sorry, we're jumping ahead a bit here, but just to note, housing units per capita, so the amount of housing there is per person in the economy, has grown since the 90s. So the idea that there are not enough homes and there's too many people, and conversely in the 90s there was so many homes, it was so abundant, whatever, and there was barely any people in the... It's ridiculous. It's not true. Now, of course, there are demographic shifts in households, for example, that do explain some variance. Even if you account for such when you count up households as opposed to population, you still get a similar outcome.
Now, government housing is an important factor here. It existed. So when people couldn't afford to live in their homes anymore, they were granted government housing.
As we went over, this changed. This actually changed in the 80s and 90s. That's what's very interesting about that period, is that governments went from directly funding and building public housing to putting that onto the market, to commercializing it, to privatizing it. So what we actually saw in the 80s and 90s was governments beginning to subsidize the private market as opposed to directly publicly building, providing public housing to people. I said public there a few too many times, but you get the idea. As we went over, no, this isn't true. The public housing stock compared to the rest of the housing stock fell during this period. It has continued to fall and plummet down to record lows to what we see today. And that trend began in the 80s and 90s. I have a video on that. Go watch it.
6 months later, he moves in. And this guy here, immigrant, he moves into the rental. This is a little bit deceiving. We didn't have immigrants in our housing then. So let's fix that up.
What do you mean?
He can go to a rental.
What
What
do you mean we didn't have immigrants in as homeowners or government housing? Are you actually what the fuck? Hold on. I can prove her wrong. I don't know if you can see this stuff, but these are photos of a community, festival gathering in the 1980s at the North Richmond, or one of the North Richmond estates. And I don't know if you could see that, but these people were Vietnamese immigrants at the time. The idea that public housing, government housing, immigrants didn't live in public housing? What? Whatever.
And this guy here, immigrant, he moves into the rental. This is a little bit deceiving. We didn't have immigrants in our housing then. So let's fix that up. He can go to a rental. And so the cycle still is fine. Let's build some homes. Fast forward a few years, right? So we're going to fast forward till now.
Fast forwarding 3 decades.
We got some people, right? What happens? Governments stop building extra housing. So government housing, that's full.
One caveat there, while this publicly owned housing has fallen, as I've been over many times on this channel, there's been a rise in community housing, which is housing provided by community housing providers, community housing organizations. Essentially, they're charities and they provide discounted housing for people who would otherwise live in public housing. Now, there are, again, videos on why this sucks, but the idea that there isn't an increase in the social housing stock and it's just remained stagnant and it's completely full and that we can't do anything or there isn't, potential there, again, ridiculous.
Homes are full. Homes are
Not true. Full. As we went over, housing per person has increased since the 1990s. We have more houses per person in this country than we did in the 1990s. We also have a lot of empty homes in this country. 100,000 in Metro Melbourne alone. There are 100,000 either underutilized or completely empty homes, and that's not including the commercial vacancy rate either. So there's a lot of property that we could, reuse, retrofit, etc. to satisfy the obvious high demand for affordable housing, given barely anyone can, afford housing these days.
Homes are full.
They're just not full.
Homes are full. There's no homes. I want to build a home. Okay. Hi, Mr. Government. I want to build a house. That'll be $120,000, please, and come and see me in 6 months' time for your approval. What do you mean, $120,000? Oh, yes. Well, now we've got things like planning fees and we've got to have infrastructure charges and we've got to do all these surveys and, there's environmental things. Well, why 6 months? Because it just takes time. Yeah, screw that. I don't have 6 months. I'm not buying a house. Building a house. I'm not building a house.
The point about regulation is there's a kernel of truth there that there is just an excessive amount of regulation in this country. It's not that regulation is bad or anything. We should have a lot of regulation. It's just that it is quite, if anyone that's ever, worked in government, everyone knows that the government is a mess to work with. And that's no different in the building industry. But the mess of bureaucracy is but one problem in our very, very, let's just say problematic residential construction industry. The Productivity Commission actually, funnily enough, did a really decent report on why our residential construction industry is pretty cooked. And the bureaucratic red tape stuff is one factor, which again is a real thing that we ought to consider. But it is one factor. And, unfortunately, this is not me. This is the Productivity Commission talking. It's those mum and dad investors and mum and dad builders who are at fault for our housing problems, at least in the construction industry. There is a serious problem of fragmentation, of a lack of economies of scale in the residential construction industry. There's lots of inefficiencies. There's lots of really bad exploitation. There's a big problem of, kids not wanting to get into, a trade and whatnot. And a big reason why is there is a stigma because they get treated like shit on a work site. And a residential construction work site typically isn't unionized, so you don't really have anyone having your back, and you get treated like shit, you get paid like shit. A big reason, and this person doesn't talk about it, in fact, they glamorize the mum and dad investor builder type. A big problem with our residential construction industry is, yes, bureaucratic red tape, government's being annoying, but also small businesses fragmenting the industry and not being equipped to actually do the task at hand.
And then, this cool concept gets introduced. You might know it. It's called Airbnb. Okay. So then we start buying houses, putting them in Airbnbs.
Yeah.
Did you notice that when we just had investors, we still kept people in the homes? The homes didn't come out of the system. Now, with the introduction of Airbnb, the homes are out of the system.
So the point about Airbnb is interesting, and it's true that Airbnb is an inflationary pressure on the housing market. You're necessarily reducing the amount of housing supply, and you're keeping it empty in favor of short stay arrangements. But people aren't living in Airbnbs. I mean, most people don't. There are edge cases and instances where people do. But by and large, they are kept empty for short stay arrangements, holidays and whatnot. And that's why a lot of Airbnbs are pretty, they're predominantly in places where people holiday a lot. Not a major player in our housing crisis. I'm not pointing to Airbnb as like the thing that's ruined housing in this country, but she's on the right track. That's probably the first good point maybe she's made.
The snakes. Let's come and look at the snakes. The snakes are still building. You might know of these guys as Mirvac, Stockland, Lendlease. They ate your little builder, which in turn made these homes ultimately more expensive. They were cheaper in the beginning because I'm big and I can build it cheaper, hence eating your local guy. But ultimately, it's made these even more expensive. And I'm going to call it China purely because China is most of our foreign investment. Chinese come in. And this foreign investment.
Oh my God.
They buy the homes. These are the homes that sit vacant. It's not the mum and dad investment.
The privatization of public housing in this country wasn't as simple as like Mirvac gobbling up public homes. She mentioned like local council. A lot of local councils hold their public homes in a trust nowadays, or they've sold it out to community housing, or they have just sold it out in general. But typically like Mirvac or Stockland, they're developers. They're not landlords. So they develop housing, but they typically don't, manage property, or at least that's not their primary thing. So the people that are gobbling up council housing, maybe they are corporate landlords. A lot of them probably are. But a lot of them are, held in trust still, or they're held by community housing providers. Anyway, the bigger point about China. So the pesky Chinese in causing our housing crisis they've bought up 40,000, right? 40,000 properties, which, nothing to sniff at. That's pretty good. 40,000 out of the 11 million residential dwellings in Australia are owned by foreign investors. So, look, again, I'm not a big fan of foreign investment in housing. I'm not a bigger fan of investment in housing, period. I'm glad that we're making it harder for foreign investors to get into the market. Not because they're foreign necessarily, but because they're investors. And because foreign investors make up such a small part of investor demand in this country, the real problem, like just numerically, right, on a pure absolute numbers basis, right, the problem are homegrown Aussie investors. They're not these foreign investors from China. Again, they're a problem. They're an issue. I don't want them either. But like, if we're trying to say and explain why we're in a housing crisis, I wouldn't just like point to China and just be like, oh, it's them. This problem is almost 100% Aussie made. I mean, again, most investors are themselves Australian. Most residential properties are owned by Australians. So
Chinese come in.
Whatever.
And this foreign investment, they buy the homes. These are the homes that sit vacant. It's not the mum and dad investor that has the home sitting vacant, because they can't damn well afford the mortgage if the home is vacant.
There are 100,000 empty properties in metropolitan Melbourne alone when you don't include the typical holiday home destinations, right? There are 40,000 foreign-owned properties Australia-wide. Again, it just doesn't make sense numbers-wise to suggest that all the vacant properties are foreign-owned ones. They're the ones causing the housing problems, and it couldn't possibly be the mum and dad landlords who are doing it, right?
We have more people than houses.
We don't.
Do you want to know who this snake is? Because the building industry is apparently booming.
Not,
although
actually.
we don't have enough tradies, we don't have enough people building the homes, and now it costs up to 100 times more to build a home just in fees. And instead of taking 6 months to build the home, it takes 18 months.
Again,
on average.
there is like a genuine problem there about housing supply, about how long it takes to build a home. There's no point in denying that the residential construction industry is cooked. I mean, it's a reality. And again, part of the reason why is a lot of the bureaucratic red tape bullshit that can be cleaned up without, sacrificing the regulatory integrity that we do need in residential construction. Because if we don't have it, and even when we do have it, there are so many shoddy builds in this country. Housing quality has gone to shit. But that is just one part of the equation that this person loves to yap on about, right? And in very nebulous terms, doesn't even talk about, specifically what's wrong, whatever, just very, very nebulously. What they don't talk about is the role of small business and how fragmentation in residential construction is also a big problem and a big reason why housing construction has slowed down and is quite difficult nowadays to even, build a home. So
to build the house. This guy here, though, this is James Hardy. You might have heard of him, right? An Australian-founded company since the 1800s. Well, he moved his corporation over to Ireland and the US. Guess how much income tax he's paid in Australia since 2006? Guess. Zero. He's earned approximately $11 billion from these builders, these homes that we're paying for, that these guys are getting fat. This guy's getting fat. He's getting fat. And we're all out here fighting, lining up by the truckload, fighting for our lives.
So again, there's like an inkling of truth here that, yes, big developers, big landlords, corporate investors, they get quite wealthy off this arrangement, the housing predicament we're in at the moment. Particularly institutional investors and financial institutions, banks, superannuation funds, asset managers, private equity, they're reaping it. They're doing great. Developers, they're doing good as well, although some are, in the mud. I'm pretty sure Lend-Lease is not doing great at the moment, but besides the point. But there's another idea here that it's a populist thing. It's shared across the political spectrum where, there's a group of, renters, workers, but also simultaneously small business owners, homeowners, etc., who are all doing it equally tough. Everyone's struggling, right? Everyone's doing terribly. And then it's these bourgeois, rich, fat cats at the top. And it's this narrative that, whatever, right? This isn't to say that, again, that the economy is doing well, that people are doing great, that people are prospering, or that, whatever, right? The problem is that the wealth being generated, that homeowners, that mum and dad investors do accrue, that wealth isn't necessarily leading to economic prosperity, but that wealth nonetheless has grown. And the growth of that wealth is the problem, is what's causing our housing unaffordability crisis. The rich fat cats, they have a role to play, and their role is significant and outsized compared to, the amount of people who run these organizations. But there's also a conversation to be had about this culture of home ownership in Australia. The idea that mum and dad investors are innocent bystanders who, are suffering because of the big guy and get screwed over. They're also part of the problem. Owning homes as an asset is the problem, right? And that's not just the big rich fat cats at the top, right? That's the majority of the Australian population. It's 20% of taxpayers that are investment property owners, right? Overwhelmingly, the speculative debt-fueled demand that drives the housing unaffordability crisis is overwhelmingly made up of owner-occupiers, first home buyers, and these mum and dad, investment property owners who own one or two investment properties. Those are the people who take out loans to buy housing. This us versus them narrative that, again, a lot of people do fall for, and there is a degree of truth there, and there is inequality, absolutely, right? But also there is a significant lack of introspection, a significant lack of, looking at our own culture and the actual economic conditions and the composition of class today, and looking at it and seeing, shit, maybe we all fucked up at some point. Maybe our parents fucked up. Maybe our leaders fucked up. Maybe there's a role that we play in causing this problem, And then the solution, if you accept that, is, well, if we're the ones causing the problem, then collectively, maybe we're the ones that can potentially solve things, right? But instead, if you have this us versus them narrative and, this bullshit, right? Then it's very easy to put all your faith in, particular demagogues, or, excuse yourself of any action, absolve yourself of any self activity. It's very politically demobilizing, and it's conducive to shit politics, I'll be honest. So, and it's shitty economic analysis. It's just bad on all levels, right? It's not good for anything, but it makes people like this feel like they're smart. So I don't know. We need to remove this pervasive investor landlord culture that's so dominant in Australia today, to the point where a majority of the population are homeowners and necessarily have a financial interest in making housing more expensive for their children and their grandchildren. That's probably what we need to get rid of.